About a year ago, I made this video talking about how I hadn't read any modern novels in my adult life. I did realize in the process that there were a few sneaky exceptions, but instead had fully immersed myself in the classics and play scripts. I asked for your recommendations because at long last I was ready to hang up the book snob title and start reading anything and everything. I had no idea where to start because I had no basis of knowledge for what I personally would prefer. But y'all gave me great suggestions and start I did, and now we're just gonna talk about what I read in my first year reading modern literature. A lot. I read a lot. This is gonna be an unscripted chat because I didn't feel like writing down my thoughts on most of these books as I was reading them. I mean, a few of them I made a video about previously, but generally speaking, I wasn't actually writing down my thoughts on the books. I thought it would just be fun to reflect on them, having now had some time after reading them. I mean, granted, some of them I just finished recently, but if you remember a book and you remember your thoughts about it a month later, 3 months later, 3 years later, it's a little different than talking about it right when you first read it. Anyway, so yeah, I guess that was just fair warning. This one's gonna be a meandering, unscripted chat. And I do want to start that chat with, shall we call it a disclaimer? I'm not showing you all of this that I read in 1 year's time to brag. It's just the topic of our conversation today. This is not to be like, ooh, look at how much I was able to read in a year. Reading is not a competition. The amount that you read does not mean you are a better reader. If you read 3 books in a year and have a good time reading them and retain the information that you read from them or are moved in some way by the stories, that is way more worthwhile than if somebody read 300 books in a year and didn't have anything happen to their brain, you know? It's way more worthwhile to read slowly and explore and enjoy the process of reading than to just read for the sake of hitting a number. And I was not at all this year trying to read a lot or to hit a certain number. I think this is 55, if I recall correctly, although I do think I counted Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is down here somewhere, as 1 book, when technically it's 4. Anyway, my point is, reading is not a competition. This is not to brag. But I will say, I have not read this much in a year since I was a child and had unlimited time. The last decade or so that I've been reading classic literature, which I'm glad I did. I've read a lot of stuff that I'm really glad I read, and I think there's a lot more really chunky, harder to get through books in classics than maybe there are in modern times. That's not fair, actually. There's a lot of very chunky books in the fantasy section written in modern times. There were a lot of really chunky classics that I read, like Ulysses. So, of course I read less, but also I can say 100% for sure I read less because I was enjoying reading less. And I read more this year because I was way more enjoying it. And that's not to say that I enjoyed every book in this stack. If you've seen some of my previous videos talking about what I read, specifically my, perhaps ill-advised, though the advice came from myself, attempt at randomly selecting books. I really hated some of these books, but I did mostly enjoy most of the books in this stack. All of that to say, what is a very basic thought. If you like the books you're reading, you're more likely to read more. There are a few general things that I learned in this year about myself and my relationship to reading. One, I don't want to know what a book is about in advance. Don't give me a synopsis when you give me a book recommendation. It's actually a turnoff. I mean, I don't really mean don't give a synopsis, like the people who have given me recommendations in comments. It's perfectly okay that you gave a synopsis. I just skipped by it. I realized that other people like that, and that's fine. But like, I am not reading the back of a book, the inside cover, wherever they've put the little blurb. I don't want to know. And I noticed that in choosing books, a lot of books that I read this year were based off of recommendations from you guys. But I also went to a lot of bookstores this year, as you might have seen in a couple videos as well. And when I was just looking at shelves and choosing a book, deciding I'm going to buy one book here, which one is it going to be, the things that I look at are the title, the cover design, and then author information. Like, not just their name. If I want to know something more about the book, I don't read the blurb about the story. I go look inside at who the author is, a little more information on the person who wrote the story. And then sometimes if I like really wasn't sure, I would look at the year the book was published. But like, that was it. Reading the synopsis of the story is not something that would help me want to read the book more. And it actually kind of spoils reading the book for me. Because of this, I have stopped reading forewords. When I was reading classic literature, it was something that I felt like I had to read. So many of those will have some sort of foreword or introduction written by somebody else at the beginning. And it was always like, well, they published this in the book. They bothered to write it. They bothered to put it in. I should read it. It's almost like a respect thing, I guess. But the thing is, forewords frequently spoil the story for you. I really think they should be put at the end of the book. If some modern author wants to like have an opinion or write a little love letter about this old book, put it at the back when I've already read the story. Like specifically, the Scarlet Pimpernel, which I'm pretty sure I read this year and is not in this stack anywhere. I might be missing a few from these stacks. But the Scarlet Pimpernel, which I talked about in a video, I didn't really like it in general, but the foreword specifically spoiled the crux of the whole story. I went into the book already knowing the twist, and it was like, why? Why'd you do that? So I think when reading classic literature, I just didn't mind as much because most of the time I went into classic literature already knowing basically what the story is, just because, you know, like, who doesn't know the story of Les Mis? I had already seen the musical, so I basically already knew what was gonna happen. Having discovered that I really prefer to go into a book totally blind to the story, I have finally been able to stop reading forewords. Sorry to the people who wrote them. You know what I do love reading is the dedication. I love a good dedication. This book is dedicated to sauce for my parents, for Anna. I just always want to know, even if they just put like, for so-and-so, I want to know who they dedicated the book to. Also, I love it when there's some sort of like quote or maybe a little poem at the beginning of the book, because it's always like, it's more mystery. It adds to the mystery of what this story is going to be. It's like, why are you sharing this with me? Am I going to find out later? Is this something that I should just keep in the back of my head? And like, I don't know what the meaning is. You know, if you just put a quote at the start of your book, readers have no idea why you've given them that quote. And so I think that adds to the mystery, and therefore I love that. Ooh, see, this one's got 3. The word is a flame burning in a dark glass. Sheila Watson. The second thing I learned about myself, which is honestly very tied into the first thing, is that I don't love genre fiction, romance, fantasy, sci-fi, mystery and thriller, etc. It's not like I hate those and I never want to read out of those ever. It just very much folded up in the first point that I made. If a book fits within a certain genre, it feels like that's already giving away something about the story to me, right? Like, it's a little bit of a clue to what the story will be like, what will happen in the story, what tropes the story will likely follow. Like, if it's a mystery and thriller, somebody's probably gonna die. I don't know, I just love the genre of fiction. I love that there's all of these books that they're like, I don't know what genre to put this in, so we're just gonna call it fiction. And I'm like, thank you, because that tells me nothing about what to expect from this story. And that's how I want to go into a story, is not knowing. Like, it is just mind-boggling to me and absolutely fascinating when you walk through a bookstore shelves, really, labeled just fiction, and you look at these hundreds of books, and it's like, what is inside each of these? How have human beings been able to come up with so many stories? And yes, they're all technically kind of the same story over and over again, but then they're also different, and that's, I don't know, it's remarkable. But if you just pull a random book out of the fiction category and you don't read the synopsis on the back, then you have no idea what that story is going to be about. And that is apparently how I want to read. I want the books to surprise and dazzle me. I want to have no idea what is coming around each corner. Third thing that I have learned about myself is that I do still gravitate towards classics, sometimes without even knowing it. There were a few books in here that technically fall within my classics categorization, and I didn't even know it until I had started reading the book. I'd be like a fourth of the way through and then be like, when was this book written? Oh, 1939. I thought it was modern. Speaking of which, I'd be fascinated to see what the breakdown is of classics versus modern fiction that I've read this year. Also, please note, many people have varying opinions on what quantifies a classic, but I'm a simple gal, and for me it is simply any book that was published over 50 years ago. There's a squirrel trying to get in my bird feeder. I don't know that they've succeeded yet. Every time I've watched them try, they've gotten like to the edge and then bailed. I think it swings too much and it scares them. It is currently 2025, so in my opinion, anything written before 1975 is a classic. And I'm fully aware that that's kind of dumb. Like, a book published in 1977 is a modern novel for me, but a book published in 1973 is a classic. But also, like, you just have to draw a line somewhere, right? Like, what else are you supposed to do? So let's see. Modern, classic. I'm gonna have to actually check on a lot of these. Oh, he's literally just trying to take the lid off. The squirrel gymnastics happening outside are thrilling. Like, honestly, I'm rooting for him. You can do it, bud. Get yourself some sunflower seeds. Oh, he bailed. See, here we go. Love in the Time of Cholera, originally published in Columbia, 1985. Technically, by my statutes, a modern novel, and I definitely would have just assumed that was classic. Am I gonna have to check on literally all of these? Ooh, a bookmark. Myopic books. Also, here's a good note why I read 55 books this year. A lot of them are very small. Specifically, when I was in England, I read a lot of like novellas and even like little, I don't know, I guess you would call this a short story. It's kind of a collection of short stories. I did consider it to be one thing. Okay, Jane Austen, really? I was about to look at that one to see if it was classic. For Jane Austen, oh, there's a dead bug in this one. Copyright 2002. Jane Austen. Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. When was it published? 1979. Modern. I finally read The Phantom Tollbooth, y'all. We did not read this growing up for some reason. I don't know. Okay, this is way more modern skewing than I was expecting. Good for me. Published in 1977. Modern. This was the only reread of this whole year. I don't typically reread books because there are way too many out there. I have no concept of like, oh, let me just read that book again because I enjoyed it. I'm like, there's 5,000 other books that you might enjoy. You gotta go read those. But I reread this because I was specifically kind of researching for a video topic, and I'm so glad that I did. The first time that I read this, sorry, I gotta say titles for the people who are listening. The first time that I read Pride and Prejudice, I definitely don't think I like intook it properly. Like, I remember enjoying it, but rereading it this time, I was like, oh my god, I definitely did not remember how freaking hilarious this book is, and all the great little subtle things. Also, I think I dropped this on the floor, and now the little corner is broken, and I'm really sad about that. Beautiful copy. My chunk of P.G. Wodehouse. I've read quite a bit of him this year. He's a good palette cleanser in between darker, heavier books that, you know, I'm glad that I read, but also are darker and heavier. When I finish one of those, I'm like, let me read a Wodehouse. This is a fascinating one. So this year I read both 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. By my 50-year cutoff thing, 100 Years of Solitude is a classic, Love in the Time of Cholera is modern. Fun times. Okay, so you know what? Here I was saying I gravitate towards classics, but there is at least twice as many modern books that I read this year. I guess you could say I gravitate towards classics because even though I set out this year to be like, I'm reading modern books now, I still couldn't help getting a lot of classics and still reading a lot of classics. But this is actually a really nice breakup. It's kind of 2/3 modern, 1/3 classic. I'd be happy to keep it that way as far as like my consistent reading breakdown, I guess, but I'm not at all going to put effort into keeping that breakdown. I found it interesting how many of these stories had something to do with war. I guess I found it interesting in a very like, that makes sense kind of way. Like either they took place during a war or they, like the storylines were very much like influenced by a war kind of thing. It was just very much like, oh, look at how much of human history and therefore the stories that we tell is just entrenched in warfare. But you know, those were also kind of the books out of these stacks that were the most educational. And I think it's important to remember that fiction can be educational. Actually, fiction is hugely educational and can be a more approachable way to be educated than nonfiction books. I mean, back as a child in school, I used to say that like I learned more from the historical fiction books that I was reading. Like I remember there being specifically this one series for kids where each book had, they were fictional stories, but each book had one real life person as sort of the setting of the story. Does that make sense? I can't remember what these books were called, but I bet a bunch of you read them. Rather than being like, this story is just set in this year and it's a fictional story around those events, it would be like, this story is in some way concerned with this real life person. They weren't the main character, but they like came into it. And I learned so much from those books about history because it was a more approachable version of history. I also learned so much from like the American Girl books that always did really well on their historical research and putting good information into their books along with the stories. Like that's true for kids, and I think we all kind of recognize that like education is more approachable when it's fun, when it has like the fictional story around it when you're a kid. But like that doesn't stop being true. There are people who love a good nonfiction book. I would certainly love to read more nonfiction books or maybe listen to them on audiobook form. But like the reality is that I do want to sit down and be entertained by a story. I am more likely, vastly more likely, to read fiction. So if I can learn about history, about different cultures, about a different person's life experience, even if that specific person is fictional, then all the better. Like that makes reading so much more. It makes it not only entertaining, but educational. That's a fun breakdown, I think. Let me just break these down into books that I feel like I learned something from versus books that I feel like I just read a story, you know? Which I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're both great. You read a fictional book to enjoy a good story, and that is fine. But I do find it really, really cool how much you can learn by reading fiction. And in this splitting up, I'm not really talking about like learning something, I guess you would say like morally or something, like the book having a lesson or a, like, what would you call that? I guess a moral. I'm not talking about that kind of learning, which yes, that can be in literally any book, but like learning about a culture, learning about a life experience that I could never have lived. Educational. So like Brave New World, definitely learned some things from that, but it's set in a fictional future. So I didn't learn, like, historically speaking, you know? That's kind of what I'm saying here. I think that made sense, even if I don't feel like it made sense. Okay, that's actually, that was an interesting thing to do, because I very much was like, oh yeah, I've learned a lot from the books that I've read over this year, but I had not at all visualized which ones I consider to be books that I learned about history, culture, other countries, other types of people from, versus the ones that I felt were more on the entertaining side. Again, kind of a 1/3, maybe a little more than 1/3 breakdown. I mean, if we just go through, this one, A Concise Chinese-English Dictionary for Lovers. Found this in England, where I must say, and some people may feel ruffled by this, but whatever, I gotta say that the bookstores in England felt like they highlighted international authors way more than I have ever seen in any bookstore in America. And I've been to a few. Only a few, technically speaking, but I've been to a few. But it just felt like every bookstore that I walked into, and maybe this is because it was London, maybe because it's, you know, the major city, but it was like every bookstore that I walked into was like highlighted books everywhere from authors around the world. And I just feel like that's something I don't see much in America. So I got a lot of books that I think I never would have heard of or never would have noticed in American bookstores while I was in London. And this is one of them. This was so good, about the experience of being an immigrant. Oof, do you find yourself lacking empathy? Try reading. It does miracles for your empathy. 'Cause wow, there is nothing like reading a story from the perspective or about the perspective of a person who is wildly different from you, to make you really kind of grasp slightly what it is like to live a very different life than your own. And I think that's a good thing, to try to understand what it's like to live a life very different from your own. On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, I got this one because the title grabbed me. I mean, what a great title. Very heavy read. I remember frowning a lot while reading this book, but definitely worthwhile reading. Definitely one that I learned a lot from. Some even like weird things, like I didn't realize that Tiger Woods was multiracial. Learned about that in this book. Also, this was a weird experience. When was this written? It was published in 2019. In this book, he referenced the Pulse nightclub. Can I say the word shooting? He referenced that in this book, which was just a strange thing to read in a book. I think especially as someone who has only been reading classics for so long, because like I was in Florida. I lived in Florida when that happened. Like I had a friend at the time who went to that nightclub all the time. And it was just so like, it was such a bizarre kind of feeling to like be reading a novel and then have somebody reference this thing that happened in my own life. I guess that's also part of just getting older. Like that's gonna happen more the older I get, especially if I'm reading modern literature, that events that happened during my own life will be referenced in the books that I read. Logically, When the Emperor Was Divine. Oh y'all, huge recommend on that one. It's not a long read, and like, again, you want to learn some things and grow a little empathy? Highly recommend. Same, Book Thief. Not a perspective of World War II that I had ever read before. You're not going to get that kind of perspective in a history book. Lula Dean's Little Library of Banned Books. I'm putting this in educational because I think if you don't know much about like the South or Midwest of America, you could learn a lot about it from this book. I don't know that it was specifically super educational for me because I grew up in Texas and I think it was a good book. I liked her writing style. I liked what she did, but I didn't super duper enjoy reading it because like it hit a little too close to home. Kindred, I have another Octavia Butler. I have Parable of the Sower on my still to read list, but I thought I would start with this one. Hugely both educational and empathy building. Hamnet, I would call it educational because I didn't know about Shakespeare's kids and everything. Also, this book is written fascinatingly, specifically in that she never, ever, ever in an entire book says Shakespeare's name. She never says the word Shakespeare in the actual story, which I think is such a fascinating way to write a book that is not really about Shakespeare. I would say it's about his wife. Y'all, crazy thing. I mean, I guess it's not that crazy. There are 2 books that I read, Hamnet and 100 Years of Solitude, that like the day I finished them, I saw the movie trailer or the TV show trailer come out. And I was like, am I summoning these? It felt very weird. It's one of those like, if I had a nickel for every time that happened, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't much, but it's weird that it happened twice. I felt like the trailer for Hamnet was very like, this is about Shakespeare, and I was like, having just read the book, it's not about Shakespeare. It's not. It's not about Shakespeare. As Long as Lemon Trees Grow. Thank you so much to whoever recommended this one to me. Side note about this and The Book Thief, these are both considered young adult. They are in the young adult section, at least at like Barnes & Noble and stuff. Y'all, don't not read a book because it's labeled young adult. Both of the young adult books that I read this year were like, oh, just stab me in the gut. Oh my God. Incredibly educational. Both of them. I mean, they're both about youths experiencing war. This one, whew. So this is about the Syrian war, which I am ashamed to say I knew nothing about. The book is set in 2011, and it's about a girl who is like 18, kind of like just graduated from high school, which really struck me because I was 18 in 2011 and just graduated from high school and starting to go to college. And I had no idea that this was happening halfway around the world. Read books. Be educated. I'm putting Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow in the education one because I learned about gaming. I learned about video games and video game development from that, but also it gave me a perspective of, he just fell off the bird feeder of like lifestyles that are very different from my own. And also I cried really hard at that one. Whew. Blackouts. I don't even know that I could describe this book to you, but oh my God, it was educational to the point where I was like, is this actually fiction or is this not fiction? It's a very kind of abstract book, but like very fascinating to read. I'm very glad I read it. This one was fun. I found it in the bookstore that's in a houseboat in London that I've forgotten the name of. It is written by a Mexican author, and I just immediately grabbed it because it's called, well, they translated it to cross stitch in English, but punto de cruz in Spanish. I thought it was really good. Again, like I learned about what it's like to grow up in Mexico in modern times, not in like a historical way, but just like, what is it like to be Mexican? And I learned so much about their relationship to embroidery. Like, oh, that was amazing. Our sister Killjoy, again, found this in a bookstore in London. Very much, again, about not immigrant experience, because this was about more of like what it's like to visit other countries as a person from Africa and what the reactions are to you as an African person very fascinating. The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, whole thing, vastly educational. I had never heard anything about what World War II was like for the people on this tiny island. Recommend. Jazz by Toni Morrison. This is actually the last book I read? Yes, I believe so. Ugh, her writing is the most poetic prose I think I have ever read. I'm really excited to read more Toni Morrison now. Vastly educational as well. Oh yeah, and then Their Eyes Were Watching God. Yeah, all of this. Y'all, read books. Learn about other people's lives, because you can't live them yourself, but the closest thing I think you can get to living a life that you could never actually live is reading a book. Way closer to me than watching a movie, watching a TV show. You're usually not even fully paying attention to those. They're brief, they're over. You really, really get to feel their feelings and understand their point of view when you read a book. Slaughterhouse-Five, I would consider lightly educational. Also very much enjoyed it. Really liked his writing style. Giovanni's Room. Yes, I talked about this in another video, I think. And then 100 Years of Solitude. Very educational, even though it's like fantasy, kind of. It's like, there's a name for it. Do they say anywhere? There's a name for like the style of writing that he did. I forget what it is, but it's something like fantastical history or something like that. Yeah, so every single book in this stack is a yes for me by my very simple yes or no rating system. I think the only one that like was not hugely a yes for me was the Lula Dean's Little Library, but I would still rate it as a yes. I still think it was a good book. I just didn't like super duper enjoy reading it myself. But I love books like this. I love books that educate me, and they're hard to read. Some of these, especially books like Where the Lemon Trees Grow, As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow, and like On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, books like these, when I finished them, I sometimes wanted to just go read a good old P.G. Wodehouse and read a good old comedy something. But that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to be struck to your core by a story. It's not a bad thing to be heartbroken by a story. These are all good things. Let's look at the rest of the classics I read. Sun Also Rises. Y'all, I don't love Ernest Hemingway. And I said that in like a story post on Instagram and got some very polarized views. It feels like everyone either loves or hates Ernest Hemingway. There were people who were like, but let me like fully go into detail about how incredible his books are and everything. And there were a lot of people who were like, yeah, same. Agatha Christie, honestly, I read one because I was like, you should read one. And like, it was fun, but I didn't love it. I know she's great at mysteries and stuff. I think I'm just not a big like murder mystery person. We Have Always Lived in the Castle. This is another example. I, for some reason, read the back of the book. Shouldn't have. Literally, it was like on the back of the book. It wasn't even a foreword or something. And it spoiled part of the surprise of the story. I was like, why did you do that? Why? Epitaph of a Small Winner is a book by Machado de Assis. Again, something that some of you recommended to me. He's a Brazilian author, and I believe kind of like their most famous author. So I found this in a bookstore in England. It was a fascinating read. I really liked the writing style, and I really liked the beginning of the book, and then I didn't like it so much by the end. The story itself, I still really liked the writing style. It reminded me of that TV show, I think it's called You're the Worst, that I had to stop watching after a couple seasons because it was basically just like about horrible people. Oh yeah. I wrote like notes about a couple of the books, just like little blurbs, and I wrote, wealthy people being apathetic assholes. Yeah, I mean, I think that was his point in this story, was to highlight that kind of a person, but like, I personally struggle to read or watch stories about apathetic assholes. The Napoleon of Notting Hill by G.K. Chesterton. I don't think I'd ever read something by him. It was interesting, kind of humorous, and kind of like, okay. Our spoons came from Woolworths. I actually probably could have put this in the educational side because this was very, it was an interesting look at like being poor in a specific time of history in a specific place. Yeah, not an author I had heard of, but one that I like grabbed because it was right by the register and it just grabbed my attention. Brave New World, that one. Any of these like written 100 years ago dystopian future books are like a little bit hard to read right now, but still good to read. Oscar Wilde's fairy stories. These were interesting. They're like fascinating little fairy tale kind of things, but they're all a little snarky or have like kind of surprising endings to them. What about over here? I Who Have Never Known Men. Highly recommend reading this. Okay, so I have thoughts on this book in relation to Kafka on the Shore. Both of these books, and I guess this is a very vague spoiler, create questions and then never answer them. As in you reach the end of the book and stuff is not explained. You don't get an explanation of why or what or how or when, like why these stories, what, how, when? No, you reach the end and it's like, no, nothing. You don't get any explanation. I did not like Kafka on the Shore. I liked his writing style. I thought it was fascinating. But when I got to the end and realized that nothing was going to be explained, I was like, wait, what? It's literally been for like the last hour. These squirrels are just going nuts. They have gotten the lid off, I think. Oh no, they haven't. That's the stone. Because it never prepared you for that. It never prepared you for the fact that you were gonna get to the end and have no explanations. As opposed to I Who Have Never Known Men, that very subtly, in my opinion, let you know from the start that you're not gonna get answers. You're not gonna get an explanation. And because it let me know that from the start, when I got to the end and there was no explanation, I was like, okay, well, you let me know that from the start. Fair enough. I guess this is just something I'm gonna think about for a long time, which I did. Highly recommend reading this book. But yeah, this one, I kept being like, oh, he's gonna have some like really cool way that this all ties together and like this gets explained. Because when I started this one, I really liked it. I loved the way he was going back and forth. I was like, oh, the mystery here is just fascinating. And then when I got to the end, I was like, this kind of feels like you just wrote anything you wanted to write because you didn't have to make it make sense. Which again, I guess is fair enough. But since I didn't know that, since he never gave any hint that that's how it was gonna be, I was very like, what? It made me want to try sitting down and writing like nonsense kind of stories. I was like, what if you just did that? Just like sit down and write a story and like you can have something happen and it doesn't have to make sense and you don't have to have a reason why it happened and it doesn't have to fit within the world. You can just like have it happen because that's very much how this is. It's like something happened and it's like, why? Don't ask. Don't ask. I'm not going to tell you why. Anyway. Opinions on those. Remarkably bright creatures, kind of just a sweet story. Like I enjoyed it, but I'm not like, wow, dazzled by it. Sweet story. Hank Green's books, I read the first one and then had to search several bookstores before I found the second one. Though granted, they might have been in those bookstores and I was just looking in the wrong place. This is the first one. An absolutely remarkable thing and a beautifully foolish endeavor. Very much enjoyed these. I have not as yet read any John Green books. I believe I have one to read over there, which I don't know why that would matter. I should specifically compare the two brothers' writing to each other. I don't know, but I very much enjoyed these. The first one is such a fascinating look at fame and how that takes over you and the desire for attention and like what it means to be doing good in the public eye. Yeah, despite these being like sci-fi, kind of like, oh, you might think like, oh, it's like sci-fi things and robots and stuff. Actually, they're incredibly philosophical and I very much enjoyed them. Big recommend there. Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, I talked about that before and like, it was fine. I didn't love it, but but it was fine. These were from my random selection exploration, probably my least favorite books of the whole year. And by probably, I mean definitely. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. I went I feel like backwards on this story. I saw the play first years ago, like the first time I was in London, and then read the play script because I bought it there, and then finally read the book now. I really enjoy this. It's very cleverly written. These were all ones that I talked about before. This was sort of the first set of books that I read off of your recommendations. And The Blind Assassin, I'm pretty sure I talked about before. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So what were my favorite books from this year? Very first book I read on my I'm reading modern literature exploration. Y'all, I freaking loved this book. It was so good. His writing style, perfection for me, for my style, for what I like. So humorous, so enjoyable. It is still my favorite book I've read in the last year. I do have some other favorites though. I'm not gonna count Pride and Prejudice because that was a reread, but of course that's a favorite. Okay, so looking through all of these stacks, I know I just talked about these, so we're not gonna do it again, but I think my honorable mention favorites would be I Who Have Never Known Men and An Absolutely Remarkable Thing, which then I'll put the second one in there, because if you read the first one, you should read the second one. Honorable mentions. If we're doing first, second, and third, it would be Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, 100 Years of Solitude, The Ministry of Time. Favorites of the year, and this is really based on me just really liking the story, the writing style. Yes, I learned a lot more and was moved a lot more and cried more at a bunch of these other books, and I think most of these are yeses, and I'm glad I read them. But as far as just straight up enjoying the experience of reading, it's these three. These were my favorites. Ministry of Time, the most modern of these three. This book, God, I liked a lot of things about it. I loved the writing style. It was really intellectual without being snobby. There were just fascinating moments to it that I was like, I've never heard somebody write that. Seen somebody write that? Seen words written in that way? I mean, it's such a strange little thing, but she specifically writes about a character having acne and another character still being attracted to them, or being attracted to them with their acne. She specifically writes she even made acne look cute or something like that. And I was like, nobody talks about acne. Although I will say Jazz by Toni Morrison has a similar thing. When I read that, I was like, was she influenced by this story? Because there's a similar thing in there where they repeatedly refer to one of the characters or talk about how she had bad skin, she had a lot of acne, and she was attractive anyway, kind of thing. I don't know, it's just such a funny thing because it's in real life, I'm yes, people can absolutely, acne does not make somebody unattractive, but you never hear that written about in a book. And by never, I mean you clearly do, because twice this year. But I think most of all, this book is a masterclass in yearning, in writing about yearning, in writing about desire in this slow, patient, subtle way that is just so freaking delicious. I have said before that I'm not a fan of spicy scenes, and you know what? It's generally because of the way they're written. It's not a blanket thing. I very much enjoyed the spicy scenes in this book because they felt earned and they deserved to be there, and I had watched this yearning build so slowly over time that when the spicy scene hit, it was yes! Yeah, but then also the book itself is so complex, the storyline is complex. There's ethics and morality. The main character is not necessarily a good person, or not even really, like, blatantly not a good person, which is so fascinating to read. I have to say though, okay, so I, like, randomly asked if I should read this one or, like, the Agatha Christie on an Instagram story, and, like, you know, 'cause I was just debating. But I got a message after I asked that, and, like, not to call out the person who sent this message, but I just found it so weirdly fascinating that I have to talk about it. They said that they didn't like The Ministry of Time because it didn't know what genre it wanted to be. And I was like, what does that mean? What do you mean it didn't know what genre it wanted to be? It's fiction. It's just fiction. And this goes back to my original point of why I like general fiction the best, because they're not trying to be anything specific. And I think that person's point was like, there's kind of a mystery thriller side of this. There's a romance side of this. There's a history side of this. There's a lot of stuff blended into this book, which is what makes it such a good story, because it's not just one thing. It's a lot of things, and that's called complexity. So yeah, I just found that thought so fascinating and so odd, because I was like, I've never read a book and been like, ugh, this book doesn't know what genre it wants to be. So, like, possibly, to be fair, because I always want to see things from other people's point of view, possibly that person either bought the book or was given the book with like this is a romance, or like, this is historical fiction, which it's not really, or like, this is a mystery thriller. Like, maybe they received the book in whatever way they did with the assumption that it was a specific genre, and then were like, well, this isn't really a romance, or this isn't really just a mystery thriller. So I guess if you went into it being like, this is supposed to be a certain genre, then you'd maybe be like surprised that it didn't fit that genre. But I don't know why anybody would give it to someone or put it in a bookstore under a specific genre, because it's just fiction. It's fiction. It's just a story with everything in it. And I think this is my biased opinion now that I have learned what kind of modern literature I like, and that is clearly general fiction. Now that I've learned that I clearly like to be surprised by the direction a story goes, I realize that's not everybody's preference. And like, again, that's perfectly fine. The important thing about reading is just to read and to enjoy doing so. But I would like to challenge you, because I just challenged myself for a full year, and like, it's not really a challenge anymore, but this will continue. I will continue reading modern literature. I'd like to challenge you to read outside of your typical genre, if you have a typical genre. Like for me, it was classics. That was completely my typical genre. That was all I was reading. And I'm not saying do it for good the way I am doing it for good. I'm not even saying do it for a year. Do it for a year. Do it for one book. I would push you to try doing it for 3 books, because if you just read one book that's abnormal for you, it might just be one that you don't like. 1 is not a good test subject. So I would challenge you to try 3. 3 books that are outside of your typical genre. If you always read romance, or you always read sci-fi, or you always read fantasy, maybe go get some books that are just in the general fiction and try them and see how you feel about them. And especially if you have been feeling a little bored with reading, or you've been struggling to get back into it, I would really challenge you to look at what you have been reading or what you used to read, if you now think of reading as something you don't really want to do, and try reading something that is as opposite from that as possible. Like, I didn't want to read modern literature because I grew up reading very specifically romance, Christian romance, maybe historical romance sometimes. I definitely leaned towards the historical romance, but it was still all romance books, and it was like, I don't want to read this. And so when I fell on classics, I was like, wahoo, finally something that I like. And then I didn't want to read modern literature again, because I kind of just locked it in my brain as I don't like modern literature, when the reality is that I don't really like romance. So yeah, this has been a lovely year of reading. I have spent most of the year looking forward to reading before bed. With a few of these books, I even read during the day. Shocking. There were points where I was not looking forward to reading before bed because I didn't like the book I was reading. I DNF'd a book for the first time. Woohoo! But generally speaking, I so enjoying reading. And it was a delightful change. And I so look forward to continuing this. I still have about this many books on my like bedside section of like, these are your next books to read. At some point I should go through all of the other books that I have, which will all be classics because that's all I was allowing myself to buy up until a year ago. But there's definitely a bunch in there that I haven't read yet. So I should go through those and like try to start slowly reading some of those with like modern books in between. It's really nice reading a variety of stuff. It's nice that I can like read a heavy book that affects my soul and then switch and read, you know, a funny little book about a butler. I recommend varying it up. I love that I love reading again. It's the best. Is my knee distracting?
Oh God, I'm gonna die doing that.
What book was the... All those books from like 100 years ago. Oh, nope, I think we're dead. I did realize in that process that there were a few sneaky exceptions. I can't say exceptions today. I also find it ironic, we don't have to get into that, is a little bit of like giving... There's a helicopter going over, we'll go back. Ow! My fingy. Haven't? Oh, that's not true. What? Hello? Should have changed the battery while I was changing the batteries.